So good morning, everyone, and thanks, Mary, for that presentation. And thanks to colleagues in Safefood for inviting us to talk to this point today. So hopefully this presentation is going to complement what Mary discussed around the raw meat fermented products. So this is safe production of ready-to-eat, unpasteurised, fermented plant-based products. So a short overview of what I'm going to discuss today. So a little bit of a background, touch on the fermentation process around fermented vegetables, key legislation and labelling, touch on some safe manufacturing considerations and some case studies that we come across as a regulator, discuss some shelf life stability, packaging, and then discuss a survey we did around alcohol in some of these fermented vegetable drink products such as kombucha and kefir, and some other supporting documentation. So I suppose the top level background, historically, fermented vegetables or fermentation in general originated in China, spread to Europe via the Mongols and Tatars. Traditionally, it was used to extend shelf life, but now, as you can see with a lot of products on the market, it also enhances flavor profiles and offers the consumers this vast array of various products. In terms of Ireland's role, there's been a limited tradition of fermented plant foods in recent years in terms of over the last 100 years or so. But there has been growth since the early 2000s, driven mainly by artisan producers, and they're becoming more and more common. We saw an increase or an uptick around COVID, where people were experimenting at home and trying different types of ferments, and that was an interesting period where people were starting to really delve into that area. Some of the products popular in Ireland in terms of the vegetable-based ones, we can see sauerkraut, kimchi, kombucha, and kefir on many of the supermarket shelves. However, when you go to the EU, the mainland EU market, there's a much more diverse range of products over there, including olives, artichokes, beans, and the likes, and fermented carrots, and all sorts of products like that in the EU market. And I suppose at a very top level, the production process here, the steps are quite straightforward. It starts with selecting good ingredients, washing them, shredding them, so there's a nice uniform spread of the plant material. Salting, if applicable, applying the correct amount of salt in order to help that fermentation, then going through the fermentation stage itself, and then the stability phase when it's actually stored in a jar and then passed on to the consumer. And the storage of products, you can see here, there's multiple ways to store the products. They can be consumed directly after the fermentation. They can be stored or refrigerated then for post-packaging. I don't want to bog you down on a graph, but I think this graph sums up the steps and somewhat the complexity and interrelatedness of the fermentation process. So you can see here I've split this into 4 phases. We've got the aerobic phase, we've the fermentation phase, with the stable phase, and then with the opening phase. And you can see there the relationship between lactic acid bacteria population, the aerobic organisms, oxygen, and pH. And you can see as we move across that, so stage 1 starts when the fermentation vessel is sealed, essentially, and oxygen is consumed by the aerobic microorganisms. And this generates a little bit of heat generally. Fresh vegetables host naturally low levels of lactic acid bacteria, and adding salt, controlling the temperature, and creating an oxygen-free environment favors the lactic acid bacteria growth. So you can see that as you move into stage 2 there, the fermentation stage. So this really begins once the oxygen is removed and can last from days to weeks, depending on the fermented you're involved with. So the lactic acid bacteria here convert plant sugars into organic acids, alcohol, and carbon dioxide. And generally the pH would drop from a neutral pH of around 6.5 to 7 to a more acidic 3.8 to around the 5 pH range. And this activity inhibits acid-sensitive bacteria, and the lactic acid bacteria then grow significantly because they have very little competition. And then stage 3, when you're looking at the stable phase, so this is generally achieved in well-sealed vessels, and most microorganisms become inactive except for these acid-tolerant lactic acid bacteria. And the enzymatic activity continues here at this point slowly, and this is the part that enhances the flavors and stability of the product. The final product is generally refrigerated less than 5 degrees for longer term storage. And just to point out, there are some products on the market, once they go through fermentation, are actually pasteurized. And this may be used for safety and reduce secondary or tertiary fermentations. And then stage 4, then when the product is actually reopened again, the anaerobic environment is lost, so air gets back in, and then of course you've got yeast and aerobic bacteria then can begin to increase again, and they begin to actually consume the lactic acid, and this will also increase the pH because that lactic acid is being consumed, and this higher pH then would encourage spoilage microorganisms, for example. So just to touch on some key legislation, and Mary has touched on some of this before, so I leave this here as a reference. Obviously, we've got 178/2002, the general overview of, food business operators must only place safe food on the market. Mary touched on some of the hygiene and foodstuffs. The Drinking Water Directive is an interesting one because, especially with these plant-based products, you're adding water most of the time to these products, and it's key that water quality is a key ingredient. People must understand it's a key ingredient, and that the water quality must adhere with those regulations. Again, the microbiological criteria of foodstuff lists out the criteria required to produce these foods, and then also the next two are around labeling. And we'll see from the survey that we done, there's a lot of non-compliance around labeling of these products. So again, just to lean on those criteria around labeling and food contact materials, just to say these products must be placed in correct food contact materials and food contact packaging, not to create food safety issues. In terms of some specific labeling considerations, especially around pre-packed food, again, there's a list here, a fairly exhaustive list of labeling considerations. But just to call out a few, some of the things that we've seen on the market, there might be products there without actually a list of ingredients or a nutritional declaration, for example. So you can see there some of the key points that just to remind people that the labeling considerations are quite extensive and they must be adhered to. The very last one there with respect to beverages containing more than 1.2% alcohol by volume. So this is actually specified in the labeling legislation for foods. Once it goes above 1.2% alcohol by volume, the actual alcoholic strength by volume must be listed on the label. But this also triggers another response where you have to engage with revenue, because then you're going into the bonded product areas where you're putting an alcoholic product on the market, and there's different tax associated with those. So just something to consider, especially if you're making kombuchas or kefirs, for example, where they may produce some alcohol. In terms of some safe manufacturing considerations, I've named a couple here: water quality, plant materials, salting, pH, wild fermentation, and packaging. So in terms of that water quality, all water used by food businesses must meet this drinking water standards as set out in the directive previously mentioned. And the General Food Law 178/2002 defines water as part of food, and it's intentionally used in production, preparation, or treatment. And food businesses are responsible for using quality water, either directly or indirectly. So directly, it's as an ingredient, for example, in kombuchas, or indirectly for cleaning or processing, for example. And if unconventional water supplies are being used, so for example, rainwater or private supplies, treatment steps must ensure that the water meets the drinking water standards. And there's also a guidance note on this from the FSAI. It's a potable water fact sheet that's available online if you want to read any further on that. And then similar to what Mary discussed around using high quality products for the meat-based ones, selection of high quality suitable plant material is also a key consideration here, because using high quality ingredients that are within their, I suppose, best state are the best ones to use. And salting then, for example, the likes of sauerkraut, there's certain levels, 2.5% volume, weight by weight for salting where applicable, ensuring that that's consistent and appropriate level of salting in the product. pH is a very important one here, because it's probably one of the only quantitative measurements that can be used when trying to understand the behavior of the ferment. Getting that pH analysis and pH sample is very important to understand how the fermentation is progressing over time. And while fermentation, especially if you're using fermentation you're not using a starter culture as such, again, this introduces the level of variability within the fermentation process. So again, to control as best you can for that. And you'll see from some of the case studies I'm going to discuss in a second around packaging and storage, very, very important, especially when it leaves the production facility. We've got incidents of exploding glass jars, for example, in some food businesses or some retail outlets, exploding bottles, recalls, and withdrawals from the market because of this secondary and tertiary fermentation that's happening on the market. So all useful considerations when working in this area. So in terms of some case studies, you can see three rapid alert system food and feed reports here. These are from the European Commission, and these are reports that are used to track European food incidents. And you can see here the first one is around carbonation causing cans of kombucha to expand and burst. So this was notified by Ireland, and it resulted in a public warning, and it related to ginger flavored kombucha. So basically the product was continuing to ferment when it was on the retail shelves, and then expanded and bursting. And if you can imagine, if that was glass, it could cause a significant physical hazard for consumers. The second one here is around South Korean kimchi, and it was notified by Italy. And you can see here this relates to allergens, non-declared allergens on the Italian label. And you can see this resulted in an official detention of the consignment and then withdrawal from the market. So significant for the FBO placing that on the market. And you can get the third one here is around undeclared allergenic sulfur dioxide and pickled cabbage from North Macedonia. So again, you can see here this is a labeling issue around not listing the sulfur dioxide. And you can see this is a serious risk, and this resulted again in the recall from the consumer. The FSAI, in collaboration with the Health Service Executive Environmental Health Service, conducted a survey maybe 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, where we went to the market and looked at fermented drinks like kombucha and kefir. We could see here that some of the products came back at almost the same strength as beer, almost 4%, and a number of non-compliances as well around labeling and storage conditions. But I'll touch on that again. So you can see when sometimes when things go wrong, it can result in unintended consequences and particular hazards to the consumer. And then obviously, if there's a recall or a withdrawal, significant expense to the food business operator. So now just to touch on shelf life of fermented foods. So manufacturers of fermented foods are responsible for setting and validating the shelf life of their products to ensure that the storage conditions align with the provided instructions. But determining the shelf life of these fermented foods doesn't follow a universal approach, and it's influenced by multiple factors, 3 of which are listed here. But there's also other, I suppose, variables such as temperature, such as fluctuations in the production facility, such as variability if you're using wild fermentation, and even variability if you're using scobies or kefir grains, for example. Over time, they can change profiles over time also. So to meet the obligation, food businesses, when they're producing food that is safe to consumers, they must adopt a tailored approach to setting and validating the shelf life based on specific characteristics of the fermented foods they produce. And again, just to point you in the direction of guidance number 18, validation of product safety, product shelf life. You can get that from the FSAI website as well, and it gives you a detailed overview of how to set and verify the food safety over shelf life. And again, touching back on the packaging of fermented foods, because it's a significant risk, and it's one that causes issues in the market. One's around gas production management, and really where you've got these fermentation, secondary fermentation or tertiary fermentation, you see that build-up of gas, and especially, I suppose, at the processing point, the gas production management, natural fermentation produces these gas levels. So using valves or fermentation airlock valves to release the pressure safely is common practice. Using the food grade packaging, as previously mentioned, and storage then to prevent post fermentation. So some products are stored in the fridge, for example. Some of it through pasteurization to actually halt the activity within the product. So there's measures there to reduce and minimize this further risk. And then glass packaging risks. Excessive pressure can cause glass containers to explode, and we've seen that on a number of incidents, products on the market. So then, just to touch back on this survey that we undertook in collaboration with the Health Service Executive here in Ireland. So we went to the market and collected 32 samples of kombucha and kefir available on the retail market. And 4 of those came back that were over 1.2%. And some of the products were between 1.5 and 3.9%. And look, this is, you may look at this and say, okay, 1.5% is not very high. 3.9% is quite high. It's the strength of a beer. And if you think of the impacts of this, especially around professional drivers, so drivers who drive lorries or buses or taxis, they have a lower threshold for alcohol by volume breath in their body if they're tested along the roadside. Similar with pilots, some policy with some airlines, there's a rule that there's 0 alcohol consumption, regardless of how much alcohol is in the body. There's 0 alcohol consumption. They say 8 hours between throttle and bottle. So if these products are in the market and unbeknownst to the consumers, they're up at 3.9%. They could be inherently consuming alcohol. And similar people with certain religious beliefs or recovering alcoholics, this could be a particular risk in terms of the undeclared alcohol. Nearly all the products had unauthorized, 91% had unauthorized nutrition and health claims. And examples of those were the likes of contains live cultures or full of goodness. And another one would be the likes of live enzymes and amino acids. These are not approved nutrition or health claims. And similarly, 3/4 of the products had issues around general mandatory label information, such as the name and address of the food business was missing, the nutritional table was missing list of ingredients, or missing the best before or use by date. And then inappropriate labeling for storage conditions. Some of the products would say best served chilled or keep refrigerated after opening, or some labeling with actually missing storage instructions altogether. So really, it's about informing the consumer here how to use these products and store them for safety. So you can see there some of the key risks are around exceeding the threshold for vulnerable groups such as pilots, drivers, pregnant women, or people with certain religious beliefs who don't consume alcohol. And the non-compliant labeling and storage instructions can mislead the consumers and compromise safety. So I have a couple of slides here for your reference, and these are taken from guidance note number 37. One is a pH calibration template, and pH is very, very important to monitor when you're looking at these fermented vegetables, because it's the only real quantitative measurement you can have. But if you're relying solely on a pH measurement, you have to make sure that the pH probe that you're using is good quality probe and it's suitably calibrated. And I would advise that calibration of pH meter should happen at least once a day. And you must understand the behavior of your pH meter as well to make sure that you're getting that correct pH reading from your products. Again, another one here around template around batch pH record template, collecting the correct pH measurements and documenting that over time, so you can see the behavior for ferments over time and understanding, is there impact on temperatures and impact on the environment? Is there an impact on batch? So you begin to understand the behavior of those ferments over time. Similar, there's one here for the example of validating alcohol testing methods. So if you're going to develop your own alcohol testing method in-house using a technique, this needs to be validated with an INAB accredited laboratory for best practice. And again, you can see the relationship here, and that template is there for you to consider. And then again, a similar data sheet for recording the alcohol by volume in the various batches, and again, trying to understand what's impacting the development of alcohol in some of those products. And finally, another couple of slides here with examples of HACCP considerations for kombucha and sauerkraut. Again, just an example of an outline of HACCP considerations, and that's listed in guidance note 37. So you can see some of the considerations and some of the critical control points for some of those products. So there, I'll leave the link there for the guidance note number 37. And I thank you for your time. And I'm going to hand over to Robin. Thank you.
Thanks, Cormac. Would you mind, Robin, are you okay there?
Yes.
Perfect.
I'm just starting that screen share.